To truly emancipate our minds from white mental slavery, all black people must learn the truth about the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior. It is the largest mass manipulation organization in the world, and it is the world's center for mass brainwashing and social engineering activities. Its brainwashing tactics are being used to allow the white society to continue its exploitation and subjugation of black people without any black resistance, by brainwashing black people to think and behave in ways that are beneficial to the white society and that are against our own interests. To our own detriment, far too many black people find it easier to assign a biblical fairy tale to our plight and a silly slave syndrome myth to our condition, rather than to learn of the true hidden social sciences that white oppressive forces deploys against us in order to facilitate their long-term oppression of us. Our core problem is that through our oppressors' monopoly over what we believe, the ignorant and brainwashed ones have been made overconfident, and the intelligent ones have been made to doubt themselves. This keeps the majority of us mentally enslaved to the elation of white oppressive forces. Millions of black people have been conditioned to believe many things that insults their own intelligence. Therefore, many will sincerely say the most ridiculous things while maintaining a straight face. Case, point, and proof. Countless millions of black people now insist that the Bible contains the true words of God and the path to our salvation. However, the fact that the Bible strongly condones slavery was in fact written by those who proved themselves as being history's most ungodly group of people, and the ungodly way of which it was brutally introduced to Africans and inherently totally disqualifies the Bible from containing the true words of God. The belief that a Bible written by our worst enemies and that was in fact brutally beaten into submission into the blood-soaked minds of our ancestors now provides the path to our salvation is an insult to your own intelligence. The belief that black people are being controlled by the Willie Lynch slave syndrome is also an insult to our own intelligence. To believe that story, a person would have to be ignorant of how true brainwashing is actually achieved. Because the Willie Lynch myth presents what would in fact be the least plausible and least effective method used for controlling generations of people. True brainwashing requires a system that's being constantly updated, reinforced, and reapplied upon the minds of a targeted population in order to remain effective. If not, its effectiveness would lessen with each new generation instead of worsening as we witness among our generation. During the 1960s, we wore afros, braids, called ourselves brothers and sisters, and we called our oppressors crackers. Today we're wearing European weaves, calling ourselves nigs and bitches, and calling our oppressors white people. Clearly, we've been made to respect ourselves lesser and to respect our oppressors more. During the 1960s, we also declared that black is beautiful. Today, millions of us are now bleaching our skins. During the 1960s, black unified protest was unprecedented and it still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. Today, we're now more divided than any previous time in history. Clearly, our people are now more mentally enslaved today than we were during the 1960s. If our condition was truly connected to slavery, it would have lessened with each new generation as we move further away from the era of slavery. The fact that our collective condition has worsened is proof that our collective condition has nothing to do with slavery, more specifically the Willie Lynch myth. Those who believe that our plight is connected to the Bible does so because they are brainwashed. Those who believe that our collective condition is caused by a slave syndrome do so because they are ignorant. Whenever people are brainwashed and ignorant, they'll always believe nonsense. To learn the truth of our plight and condition, all black people must elevate our minds above a biblical fairy tale and a silly slave syndrome myth, and learn instead of the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior. The Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior is the largest mass manipulation organization in the world. It is the world's center for mass brainwashing and social engineering activities. It grew from its beginning at the Wellington House into a sophisticated organization that was to shape the destiny of the entire planet, and in the process change the paradigm of modern society. With connections to the U.S. research institutes and think tanks, the Tavistock has a large reach. It was initiated in 1946 when it developed from a Tavistock clinic and was formally established into a separate entity on September 1947. The brainwashing mass manipulating tactics developed by the Tavistock Institutes are secretly used to steer society in ways that serve the objectives of the ruling elites. Before explaining how those mass manipulation tactics have also been used against we black people, I'm going to talk a little bit, give you a little bit of background on the history of the Tavistock. It'll give you some context, okay? Just a brief summary. The Tavistock institution, about 100 years ago, a group of very affluent white elites that included J.P. Morgan dynasty, the Rockefeller dynasty, the Rothschilds from Europe, and the Warburgs from Germany, set in motion a plan to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world, basically using Great Britain as the nucleus of its system, which also would be joined with the U.S. under the Anglo-American establishment. In order to meet this objective, those elites had to develop ways to control the collective minds of the masses. This therefore required taking control of the mainstream media, because the definition of values by which people function is greatly influenced by the mainstream media. Therefore, those who control the mainstream media control the brainstem of the nation's collective consciousness. Because perceptions created by the media leads to non-deliberate, thoughtful decision-making or decisions below the level of consciousness. It has been called thinking without thinking, and it ultimately leads to unconscious similar behaviors. It doesn't matter if the information is true or not. Most people will agree because they too have been repeatedly given the same information. The way in which these elites took control of the mainstream media is that J.P. Morgan hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 men were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to determine how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policies of the daily press in the United States. The 12 found that it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the great papers. An agreement was reached, the policy of the newspaper was brought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the social engineering objectives of the ruling elites. As time progressed, they also acquired radio and television, more media outlets, giving their control influence even greater. Now, it is believed by many researchers that the Orson Welles aired radio broadcast in October 30th, 1938 of H.G. Wells' War of the World, in which it was made to appear real, was actually secretly funded. It was by the Rockefellers Foundation to prove the effectiveness that media has upon targeted audience. Upon hearing the radio broadcast about the invasion, the public, believing that they were hearing was true, responded with panic and violence. Acts of crime were carried out against each other, against businesses. There was public looting, and in the streets, people were fighting. You can Google the story, Orson Welles' War of the World. The false radio show turned people against themselves. That event proved beyond a shadow of doubt that the media could be used to not only control targeted populations, but also could be used as a weapon of mass destruction against targeted populations. Now, what is known to be a fact is that after the program aired, the Rockefeller Foundation and the CBS heads then funded a study at Princeton University on how mass media manipulation can be used as a weapon against large targeted population. The highly funded research that followed in the aftermath directly led to those ruling elites creating the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior to steer society towards their objectives. A main architect of the brainwashing tactics developed at the Tavistock Institute was Edward Bernays. Bernays was a mass manipulation expert. He was one who probably impressed upon the ruling elites the potential of large-scale propaganda to control public opinion. He's regarded as the father of mass manipulation propaganda. Bernays was the first mass manipulation expert to use his uncle Sigmund Freud's study of the human mind to master the science of mass manipulation. Bernays wrote in his 1928 book Propaganda that if we understand the mechanism and motive of a group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them even knowing it. Bernays further stated that the human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it's possible to control the input into the human mind, then no matter how intelligent a person may be, it's entirely possible to control what he or she will think. The Tavistock Institute praises Bernays as being his greatest prophet. Bernays was also appointed as an advisor to several U.S. presidents, from Woodrow Wilson to Eisenhower. The Tavistock Institute markets itself as being an organization that applies social science to contemporary issues and problems. During the 1960s unprecedented unified black protests, it was determined that the United States Negro problem was precisely the type of contemporary social issue problem that the Tavistock Institute was created to address. More specifically, it was determined that those mass manipulation tactics developed by the Tavistock Institute could be used to control the black masses and to subdue unified black protests. The system deployed against African Americans worked so well and was so effective that all white governments now use the same tactics against their black populations as well. Those that know the truth must teach. African proverb, okay? During the 1960s, African Americans' unified protest against the U.S. system of racism was unprecedented. African Americans confronted on all fronts. It was confronted through civil disobedient tactics, militant means, nonviolent protests, and with black lawyers pleading for equality within America's highest court. African Americans' unified protest still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. African Americans had unknowingly proved themselves as being the greatest threat against the U.S. system of white supremacy. In the face of such unprecedented unified black protests, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said that the unification of the American Negro was the greatest threat against the nation. To remedy what was then called the Negro problem in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson put together a committee called the Kerner Commission. Their assignment was to study the Negro problem, find the cause of the problem, and then develop solutions. In 1968, white social scientists hired by the Kerner Commission determined that an aggravating core factor for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests was caused by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They also learned that while the oppressors, through the weaponry advantages of guns and cannons, can brutally invade and enslave a people, they, however, cannot win their loyalty or sustain peace indefinitely with those people unless their minds have been manipulated to think in ways that prevents them from unifying against their oppressors. Because whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions against their oppressors will continue to grow until it reaches a boiling point, resulting in massive acts of rebellion against their oppressors. The oppressed always eventually rebels against their oppressors. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are being oppressed for long periods. This is what was happening during the 60s among the African American population. White racism had reached a boiling point within the collective minds of African Americans, which resulted in that decade's unprecedented unified black protests. Something had to be done to fundamentally change the African American culture. More specifically, something that would keep our collective self-esteems low and keep our collective aggressions shifted away from the white oppressive society, thus subduing unified black protests. Those white social scientists determined that these objectives could be met by deploying an ideological subversion system against black people. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tactic that uses misinformation and deception to change a targeted population in ways that are against your own self-interest and instead in ways beneficial to their enemies. The technique utilizes disinformation propaganda campaigns in order to get a targeted audience to believe whatever the creator of the disinformation wants them to believe, regardless if it's true or not. People will accept it if it's constantly given to them. It involves carefully altering the perception of a targeted audience to suit the objective of the creator of the disinformation. The term originated within the U.S. military as a part of their PSYOPs program, describing how selective information is provided or denied to a targeted audience to influence their emotions, their motives, and objective reasonings in order to promote changes in their behavior that are favorable to the content creator. This ideological subversion system keeps the self-esteem of the black masses very low, and it keeps our collective aggression shifted away from the white society and redirected towards ourselves by merely keeping us believing the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. This is the hidden reason why virtually all information that black people receive from the white society about ourselves are consistently negative and black racially devaluing, demoralizing. When critically thinking, can't you see just how cartoonishly unrealistic the scenario actually is? People are easily controlled by the narratives that they receive about themselves. When people are constantly fed positive and affirming information about themselves, this raises their collective self-esteem and unifies them. It doesn't matter if the information presented is untrue. Most people will act upon it because they've all been given the same information about themselves. However, when people are constantly fed negative, demoralizing disinformation about themselves, the exact opposite happens. When people are constantly fed negative information about themselves, they become demoralized, divided, self-loathing, and they become more compliant with their oppressor's dominance over their lives. In fact, many will even prefer it. This also creates self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds a people, and they can then be ruled over indefinitely. And again, it doesn't matter that the information presented is untrue. Most people will act accordingly because they've all received the same disinformation. This is the truth of our plight and condition. This second example is what's being done to black people. It's not a silly slave syndrome. Presently, all narratives about black people are written exclusively by white people. Whatever the white source says about black people is automatically deemed as factual. This unfair scenario allowed the white society to easily negatively shape how black people perceives ourselves collectively. And keeping us believing the fraudulent words about ourselves is how they now prevent us from unifying against them. This nefarious warfare tactic works by tapping into the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to mentally enslave millions of black people. Here's a basic example of how this psychological warfare actually works, broken down to the most simplest way. Imagine that a crew was out at sea aboard their very own well-functioning ship, and that their ship was being followed by a second ship. A second ship constantly broadcasting derogatory messages to the first ship's crew. Such messages telling them that their ship was lesser, not seaworthy, perhaps slowly sinking, or that the crew was planning a mutiny, or that the crew was incompetent. With time, the crew constantly receiving a negative derogatory message about themselves, being unable to refute nor confirm them, they will grow weary, paranoid, and will eventually come to accept the negative narrative. They will internalize it. This will eventually cause the crew to become distrustful of each other, doubting each other. They'll start doubting their abilities and become self-hating. The taunted crew may even become so besieged by deep feelings of inadequacy and resentment towards their fellow crew members that they may jump into the sea and swim towards the taunting ship, now believing it to be superior to their own ship, even if their ship was in fact the better one. This entire process was accomplished by constantly inundating the ship's crew with negative, demoralizing disinformation about themselves. Its weapon was the negative message and the way that they negatively affected the targeted crew. It is a process with the objective to erode the morale of a targeted population through continuous and unrelenting demoralization. By destroying their morale, it can even prevent their will to fight. It's very effective. No group can be constantly inundated with negative, demoralizing disinformation about themselves and not suffer some adversely effect. Within a real world setting, this same demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare tactic is being deployed against black populations through unrelenting media subliminal programming. The reason why many black people are now self-loathing, perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and revere as Caucasians in spite of such a brutally horrific history of violence, discrimination, and oppression has nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. Willie Lynch never existed. This noted mindset that exists among far too many black people is the deliberate result of repetitive media subliminal programming. Most people naively believe that the media reflects our reality, but it is in fact rarely ever the case. The media most often forms our behavior, our beliefs, and our perception of reality, and our perception of our collective self through the images and narratives they routinely show us. Through repetitive media subliminal programming, an entire generation can be steered towards an implied objective. The definition of values by which people operate are greatly influenced by the mainstream media. Therefore, the white society's control over the mainstream media content that black people systematically receives allows them to control what black people believe, as well as how black people will behave in regard to those beliefs. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of black people that amplifies the negative to the point that it distorts our reality is much more than just biased media reporting. It's actually an insidious black racially demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. Demoralize, divide, and rule is a method of maintaining control over a targeted population through constant and unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-hate and division between them. The white society controls all mainstream media image of black people, and they write all of the narratives about black people. The white society therefore literally owns black people's interpretation of ourselves collectively. It can even accurately be said that black people's interpretation of ourselves remains enslaved by the white society. Because they exclusively control them, they negatively distort both our media images and our narratives in order to condition us to perceive ourselves through a false, marginalized, and inferior identity that aids them in maintaining their social dominance over us. This system is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent and worst narratives about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent Black racially demoralizing propaganda is pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of Black people without being challenged nor counterbalanced by an equal amount of Black positive racially affirming fact. It conveys a subliminal message that Black people are now our own worst enemies and we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. Its weapon is the demoralizing message that it carries and the way that it adversely affects Black populations in terms of our behavior. With time, being unable to refute the constant negative information about ourselves, many Black people eventually comes to accept them. Many Black people then experience profound feelings of humiliation, and we ask ourselves, man, why we can't get our act together? This unrelenting humiliation then causes many Black people to become demoralized, divided, and self-loathing and resentful towards their own people. It is in most extreme cases, many Black people will attempt to disassociate themselves from other Black people. Psychologists call this disassociation. It's a defense mechanism that evolves to put a distance between themselves and from the pain. Some will make it their personal mission to go out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. Some will also become subservient towards white people. This is a social science that's being deployed against our minds. This is all possible because people are like computers. All you have to do is keep giving them certain information every so often, and you can persuade an entire generation of people towards an applied objective. This is how they changed from the 60s to what we are now. And as I said before, it doesn't matter that the information is untrue. Most people will agree with it because they've all been given the same information. So those are the narratives that they function based upon. Plus, because perceptions created by the media leads to a non-deliberate, thoughtful decision-making or decision below the level of consciousness. As I said earlier, it's been called thinking without thinking. And it ultimately leads to unconscious similar behaviors. Those Black people, right now there's somebody who insisted, those Black people that insist that they've confirmed their negative assessment about our racial group based upon their own individual experiences, they are in fact delusional because it's not humanly possible to assess the collective state of millions of people based upon anyone's individual experience. It's not humanly possible. Those false negative perceptions about our racial group were actually deliberately ingrained into our minds by white oppressive forces that exclusively writes all of our narratives and controls our mainstream media images. They've embedded those thoughts into our minds. The reason why many Black people insist that they've confirmed their negative assessment about our racial group, although they have in fact not, is because once a false belief has been successfully embedded into the collective mind, into the human mind, a person will then only notice those smaller incidents that appears to confirm the embedded belief and will become psychologically blinded from noticing all of the greater amount of evidence refuting it. The person will then insist that he's seen with his own eyes that it's true, although it's not. Here's an example that explains how this psychological phenomenon works. If the belief that all Asian drivers are bad has been embedded into an individual's mind, he or she will then only notice those bad Asian drivers that appears to confirm the embedded belief and become psychologically blinded from noticing the great amount of excellent Asian drivers. And then based upon his blindness, he will say, I've seen it that Asian drivers are the worst. But it's untrue. Then, based upon his blindness, he insisted, but he only noticed the ones who fit his embedded belief. Likewise, this same inherent flaw within the human psyche has been exploited by white social scientists to trap black people into a perpetual state of black self-contempt. They achieved this by manipulating millions of black people to believe the fraudulent worst about our group. We then only notice those things that appear to confirm the embedded beliefs, and we become psychologically blinded from noticing everything else, the great amount of evidence that refutes it. This is how they keep us mentally enslaved. They've been studying the mind. So when we're just sitting there reading our Bibles and Willie Lynch, they're laughing at us. Okay? Now, case in point, those black people that have been brainwashed by white media controllers and propagandists to believe that our racial group never supports each other, but are instead like crabs in a bucket that only pull each other's down, ignores the fact that during the 2008 election of President Obama, he received more black votes than any previous president in U.S. history. Millions of black people that had never before voted in any previous election registered and voted for Obama in 2008. In some states, black people stood in line for up to 5 hours to vote for him. During Obama's inauguration, millions of black people showed up in Washington, D.C., in record-breaking number, staying in expensive hotels at their own expense and standing out in that cold temperature. It was freezing to watch him be sworn in as the first African-American president. This totally destroys the myth that black people don't support each other. And many more, countless facts. I can go on to show that we are not like crabs in the buckets, always pulling each other down, that we don't love each other, we don't support each other. But once they've embedded into the mind of someone, they will insist, no, I see my own eyes. And if they don't, those who don't critically think never notice their mental change. Keeping us believing the fraudulent words about ourselves is how they now control and subjugate us. This control system prevents massive unified black retribution against the white society by lowering our collective self-esteem, shifting our collective aggressions towards ourselves, and dividing us. It's how the white society now protects themselves from massive unified black retribution. And I say, those black people who don't critically think never notice their mental change. You know, white people come home from work, they watch the news, and they're getting information. They're all being lied to. But we don't have the luxury like they have. We can't accept that information because the information is embedded with propaganda that's designed to make us think in a way that serves the white society. If you're not a critical thinker, you're already brainwashed. If you're not a critically thinker that questions the validity of all information that you receive from the white society, you are mentally enslaved. They've already subtly mentally enslaved you. If you're not a critical thinker, you are mentally enslaved. If you don't think that the white society are using their monopoly over information that we receive to manipulate our minds to think in ways that benefit the system of white supremacy, you are naive, you are ignorant, or perhaps even a damn fool. Given the history shared between the white society, and given that their exploitation of Africans continue indefinitely, to not brainwash African Americans would be against the interests of the white society. This is our hidden reality. This psychological warfare system provides the white society with a more proficient method for controlling black people, given that it isn't easily recognized nor easily comprehended by most of its black victims. For unlike the past blatant racist system that black people were easily able to identify and therefore develop counter strategies against, this system is not easily recognized nor comprehended by its black victims. White racism always prevails best when the black victims no longer recognize it. This psychological warfare program works so well, in fact, that it not only makes black people more compliant with white dominance over our lives, it in fact makes many black people even prefer it. It is at the root of both the profound division and self-hatred now inflicting so many black people, and it's at the root of the false feeling of inferiority that many whites possess. It's also the root of the narcissistic ignorance that many whites possess. The oppressed will always believe the fraudulent words about themselves. We've normalized our collective statement. There's nothing normal about it. There's nothing normal about black people always walking around speaking negatively about our race. You sit in the barber shop and someone walking, talking at me in the grocery store. We all get together and we always speak from this point where we're speaking down about our race. That's because a value system that protects and serves the system of white supremacy has been embedded into our minds through the white society's monopoly over information that we receive, and we've normalized it. And the reason why it continues is because we no longer have true leaders. Our leaders are now puppets. Their organizations are now 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Therefore, the U.S. government can cut funding off to them just like that. If those so-called leaders engage in something that truly liberates us. Because to engage in something that liberates us is against the interests of the white society. The white society's objective is to maintain their social dominance over black people. This is our reality. And when you're sitting around just reading your Bible or you reading Willie Lynch, you are ignorant. And there are those in power who are laughing at your ignorance. You have to be willing to elevate your mind and see the reality. You are in the black people's matrix. One love and peace.